right, it is time for...
This is Pimp My Portfolio. Pimp My Portfolio.
That's it. Pimp My Portfolio, where you have the opportunity to submit your portfolio to get our expert, Luke Larrative, to give his thoughts on how it could be improved. Luke, welcome back to the studio.
Expert's very loose.
Well, I'm
Loose
sure
use
if
of the word.
That's not the introduction we're looking for.
You're more of an expert than us, that's for sure.
Now, this is a first for Pimp My Portfolio. We've had our first official no-show, but Shane, who we couldn't get on the phone, has still submitted his portfolio.
He's a busy man, Shane.
He
Hard to
is,
get hold
he
of.
is.
Very hard to get hold of. Time is
He
money.
has a lovely voicemail message, as we've heard a few times.
He was very excited to come on.
Yeah, well, sorry, Shane. Luke's a busy man. You got to take your shot when you can. But we do have Shane's...
Lunches for wimps, Shane. Lunches for wimps.
But we do have Shane's portfolio. So we thought, Shane, when you listen back to this, we thought we could still go over your portfolio and unpack what you've been doing and how Luke thinks about it and some of the general lessons that you can take from it and then we can all take from it. So as always with these segments, we're going to start with a bit of an overview of your portfolio. So Bryce, what are we looking at?
So Shane's portfolio is a mix of ETFs and individual stocks. There's about 25 or almost 30% of the portfolio is in two leveraged ETFs, GEAR and GJUS. And then the next biggest holding is Pilbara.
Pilbara. Come on, bro.
Pilbara. I now just do it because it's a thing.
It's
anyway.
a thing, yeah.
So what stands out to me before we get to the individual stocks is that there are a number of thematic ETFs as well. So you mentioned the two leverage ones, but then there's also a Bitcoin ETF, a Global X Bitcoin ETF. There's a silver exchange traded product.
Yep.
There's gold.
Yep.
India and also
Semi.
Yeah, and uranium.
And VDHG.
So I guess, core portfolio, VDHG, and the two leveraged ETFs, potentially. They're more index tracking, and then there's a number of thematics. And then you mentioned individual stocks. Pilbara, CSL, Linus is in there.
Minres, Elders.
Minres, a few miners. All right, that's probably a good enough overview.
Yep.
So with that in mind, Luke, what is the name for Shane's portfolio?
After the very, very hot, chilly, the California Reaper.
California Reaper.
California Reaper.
Okay.
What's the context for that?
Look, just for the leverage and the spiciness of it. And look, actually, I like the leverage, right? To be honest, I think not enough people use leverage in investing. It works both ways, and I think the cash call potential of a margin loan and the stop out on some of the warranty derivative type product can be challenging for people. But if you've got the cojones for it and you've got the right kind of weightings and your portfolio is set up properly, it can be pretty effective for young people in the same way that the only reason you make money on a property is because it's geared 5 times. So probably more interesting than talking about the general market following stuff. Like we'll go nitty gritty. I'll ask you guys actually maybe as a point of interest, Semi.
Yeah.
Every ETF, every Equity Mates person I speak to seems to hold this ETF.
Nice.
Is this just Nvidia fever or what's the go here?
Probably. There was there was TSMC fever before, but that wasn't as contagious. I'm really trying to torture this metaphor. But yeah, I think like the last couple of years it's been big focus.
But I think it makes sense, right? If you've got someone who doesn't want to have to pick between Nvidia, TSMC, ASML, like this is an ETF that like it has performed incredibly well for it's done its purpose.
Yeah, sure. I would just argue like if you're good enough to name those 3 stocks, well, you should be good enough to buy them yourself.
Fair, but there's also like a 10
value.
others in there that can't be named that have equally contributed. We were looking at an episode where it's the rising tide lifts all boats, and so this ETF is I can understand why a lot of our community are in it.
I think I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just trying to have an interesting conversation.
I think like the thesis is different. It's like when there's individual stocks that you're picking in a sector that you think is interesting, it's like you're willing to take on the idiosyncratic risk of like, this is a company that's going to execute, this is a company that has technology that's going to outperform, or in like the supply chain of semiconductors, like I'm going to say that Intel's foundries are going to be more popular in the next wave of 3 micron semiconductors than TSMC's foundries. Like you're making a bet on a company, whereas the thesis around the ETF is I am betting that this thematic is going to, as a whole, grow, and I'm not going to try and pick winners.
Yeah, and I think that's probably where these thematic ETFs get appeal. I suppose we did some work recently because I've seen so many of these things and recently in these portfolios for the first time, and they all sort of underperform eventually, right? It's better to own, longer run, it's all better to own the market. So unless you're going to be good enough to buy and sell these things, I think buying them in the first place can be a bit erroneous. And I'm glad that everyone's making money on the Momo trade at the moment, and I'm glad that I'm glad that these ETFs allow you to do that in a more diversified way than having to pick one or two, or be able to spend $1,000 and get exposure to a theme. So I don't begrudge people for buying them, and I think they're a good idea for certain things. I do just wonder though, it's not. These ETFs have proven over time they're not bottom drawer.
Yeah,
and you know what I mean? Like this needs to be actively managed like you would pretty much manage a stock.
Yeah, and we talk about that. Like these shouldn't make up bottom of the drawer. Forget it for 40 years. Core portfolio ETFs.
But there's nothing in my view that is bottom drawer. But if you wanted to play that bottom drawer game, this isn't what you play it with.
You don't think a broad-based index fund is bottom drawer?
I think that is.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that I don't buy broad.
Oh,
funds,
okay.
right? So
nothing in your portfolio.
No. But I think that if you're if that's what you're doing, and it's perfectly reasonable and sound, as we've talked about a lot, I wouldn't be putting these sector-based ETFs in that bucket. They're in your satellite.
I reckon a lot of people think of thematic ETFs as core. I certainly used to. Like, I used to think like ETFs are all core, but now, I'm very much on the treat them as stocks.
If you want to, my view on these sort of thematics is to find, I prefer to find managers who can gain exposure to these things, but in a more measured way. And so whilst the concentration's great and it's worked out well for this particular example, there's lots of other things that haven't worked out so well in these sector-based ETFs. And I would just rather have an active manager who says, okay, I have been through every single stock in the semi-sector, and I'm going to own NVIDIA and ASML. I'm just pulling names out of my bum. But I'm going to also own them with Petrobras and BHP and Louis Vuitton, Moët Hennessy, and a bunch of other stocks in a diversified portfolio. I just feel like you want to be able to source alpha from a range of places, and that's really just spicy beta.
Yeah,
and that's kind of sort of what I don't like. I like, if you think about a equity market neutral manager, which maybe you guys haven't talked much about before, essentially that's me saying I'm going to short Rio to the same value that I'm going to buy BHP, and I'm going to bet that BHP on a market neutral basis is going to outperform Rio. So I like to think of things in that kind of context as well. And I reckon, the beta side of it's kind of a bit so.
I want to ask about another feature in the portfolio we mentioned earlier, the gold ETF and the silver ETF.
Mm-hmm.
First time we've seen a silver ETF. How do you think about these commodity plays in a portfolio?
I think gold has its place. It's got pretty low correlation to equity markets. It's a pretty decent diversifier. It's one of the better diversifiers out there. I don't know if that's an ETF that buys physical gold or it buys stocks.
It is.
Yeah, the physical gold stuff I like. So the gold stocks, particularly if it's an Australian-focused one, they are, in my view, more of a warrant or a leverage play on Western Australian labour costs, and not so much a play on the gold price. But the physical gold stuff I actually really like. I understand the sort of the macro arguments to it, but I think the idea is just not to get too complicated with it or try and be too clever about it. Just understand that historically, gold's, I think it's like 0.2 beta, so it's pretty low correlation. It's going to give you some diversification benefits, gives you a hedge against inflation, but at 2%. You got to start asking yourself, how much of a hedge am I actually getting here?
Yeah. So that's 2% of his portfolio.
Yeah, and the same with the silver thing. The silver's kind of a play on, the same sort of themes in a lot of ways. There's a lot of I don't want to use the word conspiracy theory, but I'll use it. Conspiracy theory type narrative around why silver is the best investment since sliced bread, and it kind of pops up every few years. I find there'll be one or two clients will ring me every sort of 2 or 3 years about they've read something on some deep dark blog somewhere, and someone's silver, it's going to be we're going to need it, and blah blah blah. I think the only argument about silver that I do like is it's very much required for a lot of renewable energy, particularly solar. You need a lot of silver, so I don't really understand the supply-demand dynamics, so I wouldn't want to comment on whether that's a good investment or not. But certainly, from what I've read, there's a thesis there, and again, though, it's kind of one of those things that's probably not at 2%. It's not going to do probably what you want it to do for you.
Just to close out, one thing I've noticed in a lot of submissions of portfolios is the dynamic between VDHG and other ETFs in the portfolio. So VDHG is the Vanguard Diversified High Growth. It's pretty much like major developed markets around the world, 70% of which is the US. And Shane here also then has large weightings directly in both GJUS, which is leveraged US, and GEAR, which is leveraged Aussie. I'd be questioning the role that VDHG is playing in the portfolio.
You just got more pretty much US
overlap.
Developed market equity exposure with 20% Bloomberg global aggregate kind of bond exposure. So I would also argue that this portfolio doesn't make a lot of sense to me if I want it to be critical. Weights are all kind of skew if some of these sort of satellite individual stock holdings. I'd be asking not necessarily the company per se, but questions about why they're there, or if they're going to be there, make it more sensible. But there's enough encouragement there to good start, not a complete 7 out of 10.
7 out of 10, nice. Shane,
7 out of 10. I'd
be
that.
taking
Yeah.
7 out of 10.
I like the gearing. It's it's unique. It's good.
Yeah.
I like the cojones.
If you think
about
that's
it.
unique, wait until you see Bryce's portfolio.
The proverbial
This
show
is the
bag.
Californian Reaper. I can't get much hotter than that.
No,
does it?
no.
Anyway. Well, Shane, I hope you got something out of that. Unfortunately, we couldn't get you on the phone, but thank you for submitting your portfolio. If you're listening at home and would like to submit yours, head to equitymates.com/contact. If you would like to chat to Luke in your own time about your portfolio, investment strategies, and personal advice, then head to equitymates.com/advice, and we'll make sure that we connect you with Luke, and he'll actually be able to sit down with you and talk you through it. So Luke, thank you.
Hit
as
my
always.
portfolio. Hit my portfolio.